In the busy city, 12-year-old Caleb lived a life most people didn't see. Every day was a struggle, as he lived on the streets, doing whatever he could to get by. Caleb had become an expert at surviving in the harsh world around him. He knew how to find food, stay safe, and avoid trouble. But most of all, he had learned to trust his instincts, something that had kept him out of danger more times than he could count. One chilly afternoon, Caleb found himself sitting by the entrance of a fancy restaurant. He wasn't interested in the food or the rich people inside. Instead, he had learned that sometimes people in places like this would drop food or money on the sidewalk, and if he was quick enough, he could grab it before anyone noticed. Today was no different. As he crouched near the entrance, he looked for an opportunity to find something to eat. He had been on the streets for days, and his stomach growled with hunger. Suddenly, the door of the restaurant opened, and Caleb looked up. A luxurious black car pulled up, and a well-dressed man stepped out. Caleb's eyes widened. The man was tall and had a confident stride. He was dressed in a sleek suit, his shoes shining in the sunlight. The man's name was Mr. Caldwell, and he was known around the city as a billionaire businessman. Caleb had seen his face on TV and in the newspapers. He was rich and powerful, a man who seemed far removed from Caleb's world. Behind Mr. Caldwell, a woman stepped out of the car. She was elegant and beautiful, wearing a stylish dress and large sunglasses. Her presence seemed to command attention. Caleb immediately noticed the way the woman walked, her head held high, her steps graceful, but there was something about her that seemed cold, distant even. She was Mrs. Caldwell, the billionaire's wife. As Caleb watched them, he felt a strange sensation in his gut. There was something about the way Mrs. Caldwell looked at her husband that bothered him. She didn't smile as he held the door open for her. There was no warmth between them, just a cool distance. Caleb couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt off. He had seen people in the streets before, people with secrets they tried to hide. It wasn't the first time Caleb had seen a couple who seemed perfect on the outside, but were struggling on the inside. The couple entered the restaurant, but Caleb stayed where he was, trying to make sense of the strange feeling inside him. He didn't know why, but he had the feeling that something important was about to happen. He turned his attention back to the sidewalk, hoping to find some food or coins to help him survive the day. But deep inside, Caleb couldn't shake the thought of the wealthy couple, especially Mrs. Caldwell. His instincts told him that he had just witnessed something far more important than a chance encounter with a billionaire. Little did Caleb know, his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. He would soon find himself in a position to save someone's life and uncover a dangerous secret that no one saw coming. After that strange encounter outside the restaurant, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about the Caldwell couple. It wasn't just the way Mrs. Caldwell looked at her husband, but the way she carried herself. There was something cold about her, something that made Caleb feel uneasy. He had seen plenty of people on the streets who acted one way, but were hiding something underneath. He trusted his gut, and right now, it was telling him that Mrs. Caldwell wasn't who she appeared to be. For the next few days, Caleb found himself back near the restaurant, hoping for another chance encounter. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his instincts told him there was something more going on with the couple. Every time he saw them, he noticed small things. The way Mrs. Caldwell would barely speak to her husband, or how her smile seemed forced when they posed for photos together. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and he couldn't let it go. One afternoon, Caleb was sitting on a bench, watching people walk by, when he saw the couple again. They were standing near a black limo, and Mrs. Caldwell was speaking to someone in a low voice. Caleb couldn't hear their words, but he noticed the way she looked at the man. Her expression was sharp, her eyes cold. Caleb's curiosity grew. He had never seen Mrs. Caldwell act like this before. She had been all smiles and politeness at the restaurant, but now, in this quiet moment, she seemed like a completely different person. Caleb's instincts kicked in. He moved closer, trying to hear what they were saying without being noticed. As he neared the group, he heard a few words that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Caldwell was telling the man in a low, urgent voice, "Everything is set. He won't suspect a thing. Once he eats, it'll be over." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. What is she talking about? He wondered, his mind racing. He leaned in even closer, but the sound of a passing car distracted him. By the time he turned back, Mrs. Caldwell and the man were gone. His mind was buzzing with questions. What was she planning? Why did she seem so calm about whatever was going to happen? That night, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about what he had overheard. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Mrs. Caldwell was planning something dangerous. He had no idea what she meant by, "Once he eats, it'll be over," but it didn't sound good. His gut told him that the billionaire was in serious trouble, and he needed to find a way to stop whatever was happening. The next day, Caleb made his decision. He couldn't just sit back and wait to see what would happen. He had to warn Mr. Caldwell. He didn't know how or what he would even say, but he couldn't let this mystery go unanswered. He had seen enough in his young life to know that sometimes the most dangerous things happen when no one is looking. As Caleb prepared to face the man he had only seen from a distance, he didn't know how the story would unfold, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let Mrs. Caldwell's cold plans come to life. The stakes were higher than ever, and Caleb was determined to find a way to save the billionaire, even if it meant risking everything. The more Caleb thought about what he had overheard, the more anxious he became. Mrs. Caldwell had been too calm, too precise in her words. He couldn't shake the image of her cold expression, as if she was planning something sinister without a second thought. Caleb's instincts screamed at him that Mr. Caldwell was in danger, but he still didn't fully understand what was going on. That afternoon, Caleb watched from a distance as the couple arrived at a high-end restaurant. Mr. Caldwell got out of the car first, looking polished and confident as usual. Mrs. Caldwell followed, but she seemed distracted, as if her mind was elsewhere. Caleb's heart raced as he remembered her words. "Once he eats, it'll be over." What exactly did that mean? Was she planning to hurt him? And if so, how? Caleb followed them at a safe distance, keeping out of sight as they entered the restaurant. He had to know more. He couldn't let them go on with whatever scheme they were planning. The danger was real, and Caleb was certain that if he didn't act, something terrible could happen. He waited for what felt like hours outside the restaurant, watching the entrance. He couldn't risk going inside. The last thing he wanted was to get caught. But Caleb had learned to be patient in his life on the streets. He was used to waiting for the right moment. Finally, just as the sun began to set, Caleb saw a familiar figure leave the restaurant, Mrs. Caldwell. She was walking briskly, her face a mask of determination. As she stepped into a black limo, she looked around carefully, making sure no one was watching. Caleb quickly ducked behind a nearby wall and followed her. He didn't know where she was going, but he knew he had to find out. The limo pulled into a quiet side street. A few minutes later, Mrs. Caldwell got out and entered a building, disappearing inside. Caleb crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to know what she was up to. After waiting a few moments to make sure no one was watching, Caleb snuck around the back of the building. Through a small crack in the window, Caleb saw Mrs. Caldwell talking to a man in a dark suit. The man was holding a small package, and Caleb's eyes widened as he realized what was inside. A small vial filled with a liquid. Mrs. Caldwell took the vial from the man and tucked it into her purse. Her voice, though muffled, was still clear enough for Caleb to hear. "The plan is set. Tomorrow, it will all be over. He won't suspect a thing," she said, a chilling calmness in her voice. Caleb's stomach dropped. The vial she had received. He had no doubt it was poison. She was going to put it in Mr. Caldwell's food tomorrow. Caleb couldn't let that happen. His mind raced, but his decision was clear. He had to stop her before it was too late. He took a deep breath and quietly backed away from the window, making sure not to make a sound. His heart was racing, but he didn't have much time. The next day, he would have to warn Mr. Caldwell about what was coming. But how could he get close to the billionaire without being noticed? Caleb knew this wouldn't be easy. He didn't have a plan, but he had to act fast. His instincts had never been wrong before, and now they were telling him that this was his only chance to make a difference. The next day, Caleb made up his mind. He would do whatever it took to stop Mrs. Caldwell and save Mr. Caldwell, even if it meant putting himself in danger. The stakes had never been higher. The next day, Caleb's nerves were on edge. He had spent the whole night thinking about how he was going to warn Mr. Caldwell. He had to act fast. The sooner he could stop Mrs. Caldwell's plan, the better. But the question was, how could a homeless boy like him get close to a billionaire without being noticed? Caleb decided to go to the restaurant again. He knew it was where the couple would likely dine, and it was also his best chance to get Mr. Caldwell's attention. The plan seemed risky, but there was no other choice. He would have to speak directly to Mr. Caldwell and warn him, even if it meant interrupting his day. Caleb arrived early in the morning, just as the restaurant opened. He hid near the entrance, keeping a low profile. He waited and watched, making sure not to draw attention to himself. His heart raced with fear and excitement, but he remained focused. He knew this was his chance to stop a tragedy from unfolding. Around lunchtime, Caleb saw the familiar black car pull up to the restaurant. Mr. Caldwell stepped out, followed by Mrs. Caldwell. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He had to act now. He waited until Mr. Caldwell entered the restaurant, then quickly moved toward the front door. Caleb hesitated for just a moment, but then pushed through the door. He scanned the room, spotting Mr. Caldwell sitting at a table near the back. The billionaire was speaking to the waiter, seemingly unaware of the danger approaching. Taking a deep breath, Caleb made his move. He walked quickly across the room, his eyes fixed on Mr. Caldwell. The waiter noticed him and gave him a curious glance, but Caleb ignored him. He had to get to Mr. Caldwell. When he reached the table, Caleb's heart was pounding in his chest. He had no plan, no script to follow. He just had to make sure Mr. Caldwell listened. With all the courage he could muster, Caleb blurted out, "Don't eat that. Your wife put poison in your food." The room fell silent. People turned to look at Caleb, shocked by his outburst. Mr. Caldwell stared at him in disbelief, his fork halfway to his mouth. His face turned pale, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. "Who are you?" Mr. Caldwell asked, his voice shaky. Caleb didn't have time to explain everything. "Your wife is planning to poison you," he said urgently. "She's been working with someone, and today she's going to try and kill you. Please, don't eat that." Mr. Caldwell's eyes widened, and he quickly looked at the waiter, who was standing nearby, still in shock. "What is this boy talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling with confusion. But Caleb was too determined to stop now. He knew he had to get through to Mr. Caldwell, no matter what. "Please, you have to believe me," Caleb said, his voice shaking with the urgency of the situation. "She's trying to kill you. The food isn't safe." The other diners in the restaurant were now staring, whispering among themselves. The waiter, who had been standing nearby, quickly walked over to Mr. Caldwell's table. He seemed unsure of what to do, but Mr. Caldwell was now visibly shaken. "I'll call the authorities," the waiter said, his voice low. But Caleb knew it was already too late. He had done all he could to warn the billionaire, and now he could only hope that Mr. Caldwell would take his warning seriously. The next few moments would determine everything. Mr. Caldwell sat back in his chair, still staring at Caleb, the truth starting to sink in. He was no longer sure of what to believe, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had just been turned upside down by a homeless boy who had somehow saved him. The silence in the restaurant felt deafening as Caleb stood by the table, heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Caldwell sat frozen in his seat, staring at him in disbelief. For a moment, Caleb thought he might have made a huge mistake. What if Mr. Caldwell didn't believe him? What if he was kicked out of the restaurant or worse? But then Mr. Caldwell's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he slowly set his fork down, his hands trembling just a bit. "What are you talking about, boy?" he asked, his voice shaky but trying to stay composed. "I'm not lying," Caleb said quickly, desperate to make Mr. Caldwell understand. "I saw your wife with someone. She's been planning something. She has poison. She's trying to hurt you, and you need to stop eating." Mr. Caldwell's face went pale as the words sank in. He looked toward the waiter, who had remained silent, watching the strange scene unfold. The waiter, seeing the seriousness in Mr. Caldwell's expression, stepped forward, his eyes wide with concern. "Sir, perhaps we should call the police." "No," Mr. Caldwell snapped, his voice suddenly clear. "Not yet. I need to hear more. Are you sure about this?" His eyes returned to Caleb, who nodded firmly. "I'm sure," Caleb said. "She was talking to someone. I overheard. They were talking about how you wouldn't suspect a thing once you ate the food. She's planning to poison you." At this, Mr. Caldwell stood up quickly, knocking his chair back. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself. The room around them seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath. The waiter quickly went to the kitchen, and Caleb could see him speaking with the chef. Mr. Caldwell, still looking shaken, turned back to Caleb. His voice softened as he asked, "Why would you come to me with this? Why now?" Caleb took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I saw something that didn't sit right with me. I've been on the streets for a long time. I've learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts are telling me that something bad was going to happen." Mr. Caldwell paused, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Caleb. He seemed to be processing everything. For a moment, Caleb could see the gears turning in the billionaire's mind. Then Mr. Caldwell turned toward the door. "Come with me," he said, his voice commanding. Confused but trusting, Caleb followed Mr. Caldwell through the restaurant. The waiter was still in the kitchen, and a few curious customers were whispering, but no one dared to get in their way. Caleb's heart raced as they stepped outside into the chilly air. "Who else knows about this?" Mr. Caldwell asked as they stood by the door. "I don't think anyone else knows. Just me," Caleb replied. "But I overheard enough to know it wasn't just a misunderstanding." Mr. Caldwell nodded, clearly thinking quickly. "We need to make sure we have proof," he said. "I can't take any chances. We'll need to figure out exactly what she's been planning." The weight of the situation seemed to press down on them both. Caleb was starting to understand the seriousness of what he had done. But despite the fear and the unknown, he felt a strange sense of pride. He had saved someone's life today. "Thank you, Caleb," Mr. Caldwell said, looking at the young boy with newfound respect. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for this. You've done something important today." Caleb just nodded. He didn't expect anything in return. He had done what felt right. But now, as they waited for the police and the truth to unfold, Caleb couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. He had stepped into a world far beyond his own, and the consequences were still unfolding. The police arrived just moments after Mr. Caldwell's tense conversation with Caleb. It was clear to everyone that something serious was going on. As the officers entered the restaurant, Caleb felt his stomach turn with nerves. He had never been in a situation like this before. This wasn't just another street encounter or fight to survive. This was real. A man's life was at risk, and it had all happened because of a simple, desperate warning from him. The officers took Mr. Caldwell aside, asking him a series of questions. Caleb stood a little further away, trying to blend into the background. His heart was still racing, and he couldn't stop thinking about the look on Mr. Caldwell's face when he first heard the truth. Caleb was scared, but he knew he had done the right thing. Mrs. Caldwell hadn't just been planning to hurt her husband. She had put everything in motion, and it was up to the police to stop it now. While the police spoke to Mr. Caldwell, The staff worked to clear the meal off the table, and the restaurant atmosphere had completely shifted. The cheerful chatter of diners had turned into a low murmur of concern, with some customers already packing up to leave. Caleb could sense the eyes on him, but he didn't mind. He was used to being ignored, but today, he felt something different. People were starting to take notice of him, not as the homeless boy, but as someone who had saved a life. Minutes later, Officer Daniels walked over to Caleb, his serious expression softening just a little as he knelt down to look the boy in the eyes. "You did the right thing, son," Officer Daniels said, his voice calm but respectful. "But you've put yourself in a dangerous position. We need to talk." Caleb swallowed hard. He hadn't been expecting this kind of attention, but he knew the officer was right. He had stepped into something bigger than himself. "I didn't want to get anyone in trouble," Caleb mumbled, looking down. "I just knew something bad was going to happen. I had to stop it." Officer Daniels nodded. "And you did. But you need to be careful. There are people out there who might not want this to be known." The officer's words made Caleb's stomach churn. What if Mrs. Caldwell's plans didn't end here? What if she tried to hurt him next? He didn't have time to think about it because just then Mr. Caldwell approached, his face a mix of gratitude and concern. "Caleb," Mr. Caldwell began, his voice shaking with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did today, what you risked, it's beyond anything I can put into words. You saved my life." Caleb looked up at the tall, powerful man in front of him, but he didn't feel scared anymore. Mr. Caldwell's words weren't just about thanks. They were about something deeper, something Caleb hadn't felt before. Respect. "I didn't do it for thanks," Caleb said quietly. "I just couldn't let her do it. It didn't feel right." Mr. Caldwell smiled, his eyes filled with admiration. "Well, whatever the reason, I owe you everything. We're going to make sure she can't hurt anyone else." As the officers took Mrs. Caldwell into custody, Caleb felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had done something good today, something that had changed everything. But as the police car drove off with Mrs. Caldwell inside, Caleb couldn't help but wonder about his own future. He had just stepped into a world of danger and consequences that he had never imagined. Would he ever be able to return to the streets after all of this? Could he trust anyone again? For now, though, Caleb didn't dwell on the unknown. He had saved a life, and that was enough. But one thing was certain: his life was about to change, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The next few days after Caleb's dramatic warning seemed to pass in a blur. The police had investigated everything thoroughly, and Mrs. Caldwell had been arrested for her role in the plot to poison her husband. The story made the headlines, and Caleb's name started to appear in the news. People were shocked that a homeless boy had saved a billionaire's life. Some saw it as a story of bravery, while others called it a lucky coincidence. But for Caleb, it wasn't about fame. It was about doing what he felt was right. For the first time in his life, Caleb was being noticed. Not just as a homeless boy, but as someone who had made a difference. The attention was overwhelming, and it made Caleb nervous. He wasn't used to people looking at him with admiration. He had always been invisible to most people, and that was fine with him. But now, everything was changing. One afternoon, as Caleb walked through the park, he was stopped by a reporter from a local news station. "Excuse me, are you Caleb?" she asked, holding up a microphone. "We'd like to interview you about what happened at the restaurant. You're a hero." Caleb froze for a moment. He had never been in front of a camera before. He wasn't sure what to say. I'm just a kid," he said, scratching the back of his head. "I didn't do it for attention. I just wanted to stop something bad from happening." The reporter smiled kindly, understanding his discomfort. "Well, your actions were brave. You've become an inspiration to many. How do you feel about what you did?" Caleb thought for a moment. "I don't know. I just did what I thought was right. I didn't think it would turn into all this." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, you've made a big impact, Caleb. Thank you for sharing your story." As the reporter walked away, Caleb felt a mixture of pride and confusion. He wasn't sure what all this attention meant, but one thing was clear: he had done something that mattered. And that was a good feeling. Later that day, Caleb was sitting on the steps of an old building, trying to process everything. The world around him had changed so quickly. The street he had known for so long now felt distant, and the idea of going back to that life seemed harder than ever. Just then, Caleb felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Mr. Caldwell standing there, smiling down at him. The billionaire had come to see him personally. "Hey, Caleb," Mr. Caldwell said warmly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me. You saved my life, and I want to do something for you." Caleb blinked in surprise. "Do something for me? I didn't do it for anything in return." Mr. Caldwell chuckled softly. "I know, but still, you deserve a chance for something better. I've spoken with a few people, and I'd like to offer you a place to stay, some schooling, and a chance to get away from the streets." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He had heard stories about people like Mr. Caldwell helping others, but he never imagined it could happen to him. "You want to help me?" Caleb asked, disbelief in his voice. Mr. Caldwell nodded. "I do. You've shown a lot of courage. You deserve a future where you can be more than just a kid living on the streets. You're smart, and I think you have a lot to offer." Caleb sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. This wasn't just a chance to escape the streets. It was a chance at a whole new life. A life he had never dared to dream of. It was an offer that could change everything. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "I don't know what to say." Mr. Caldwell smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just take the opportunity, Caleb. You've earned it." As Caleb stood up, he realized that his life was about to take a new turn. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time, he felt hope. He had saved a life, and now he had a chance to save his own. With a deep breath, Caleb followed Mr. Caldwell, ready to step into the unknown. A new chapter was beginning, and Caleb was determined to make the most of it. As the weeks went by, Caleb found himself adjusting to a life he had never imagined. The moment he accepted Mr. Caldwell's offer, everything began to change. No longer did he need to worry about where his next meal would come from or where he would sleep at night. He was given a small, cozy room in a safe neighborhood, with a bed that didn't feel like a luxury but a new way of life. The first few days were overwhelming. Caleb was enrolled in a local school, where he was placed in a class with students his age. He was nervous about starting school again, but something inside him told him that this was his chance. He had always been smart, but he had never had the opportunity to show what he could do. Now, he was determined to make the most of it. The students at his new school were kind, and for the first time in his life, Caleb felt like he belonged. He didn't have to hide in the shadows anymore. His classmates didn't judge him for his past. Instead, they treated him like any other kid. Caleb quickly made a few friends, and he started to enjoy going to school. It wasn't just about learning new things. It was about finding a place where he could grow, a place where people saw his potential. Outside of school, Caleb spent time with Mr. Caldwell, who had become more than just a benefactor. He had become a mentor, someone who genuinely cared about Caleb's future. Mr. Caldwell took him to meetings and taught him about business, showing him how the world worked beyond the streets. Caleb was surprised at how much he could learn from someone who had so much, but who also wanted to share that knowledge with him. One evening, Mr. Caldwell sat Caleb down and asked him, "So, what do you want to do with your life, Caleb?" Caleb thought for a moment. He had never really thought about his future this way before. He had always lived day by day, just trying to survive. But now, with all the opportunities before him, he realized he had choices. He could be anything he wanted. "I think I want to help people," Caleb said, looking up at Mr. Caldwell. "I want to be someone who makes a difference, just like I did before. But I want to do more. I want to help people like me, kids who don't have a chance." Mr. Caldwell smiled warmly. "I think you're on the right path, Caleb. You've already done something incredible. Now it's about finding ways to keep doing that, and you'll find your way." Those words stayed with Caleb, and as time passed, he began to think more about how he could make a difference. He started volunteering at local shelters and community centers, helping other kids who had been through tough times. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about giving back, about showing others that there was always a way out, just like he had found. As the months turned into years, Caleb's life transformed completely. He was no longer the homeless child on the streets. He was a young man with a future full of possibilities. He excelled in school and earned a scholarship to college. His relationship with Mr. Caldwell grew stronger, and he began to see the billionaire not just as a man who had given him a chance, but as a father figure who had shaped his future. Caleb never forgot where he came from, and he always remembered the moment when he decided to act, when he saved a life and changed his own. It was a reminder that no matter where you start, you have the power to create a future for yourself. With a heart full of gratitude and determination, Caleb embraced the life ahead of him, knowing that his journey was just beginning. The boy who had once been invisible was now a young man on a mission, ready to make his mark on the world.